People like you don't walk in here with checks like this. The words landed flat and cold, cutting through the quiet hum of the bank lobby as if the air itself had stiffened around them, and for a second, no one moved, not the woman in line behind Angela clutching a deposit slip, not the teller 2 windows down counting out 20s, not even the security guard by the glass doors who had been half watching the street outside. All eyes shifted, subtly, toward the sound of paper sliding across polished marble, toward the tall man in a tailored gray suit, standing behind the counter, his fingers resting on the edge of a check that didn't seem to belong in his world, and across from him, Angela Brooks stood still, her coat slightly wrinkled at the sleeves, a faint scent of antiseptic clinging to the fabric as if she had just come from somewhere that mattered more than this room, somewhere quieter, heavier, and her hand, still extended from offering the check, hovered in the space between them before slowly lowering, not in defeat, but in restraint, as if she were measuring something deeper than the moment itself. The overhead lights reflected softly against the polished floor, casting a pale glow that traced the edges of her shoes, worn but clean, grounded, while outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sun filtered through passing clouds, flickering briefly across the glass like a pulse, and Daniel Carter watched her with a practiced expression. The kind built over years of quick judgments and faster dismissals, his jaw set, his posture precise, every inch of him signaling control, certainty, authority, yet there was something in Angela's gaze that didn't match the script he was used to, something steady, unhurried, almost quiet in its refusal to react the way he expected. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't glance around for support, she simply met his eyes with a calm that felt out of place in a room designed for transactions, not truths, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of a wall clock above the customer service desk, counting seconds that stretched longer than they should have, as if time itself had slowed to watch what would happen next, and somewhere behind Angela, a man cleared his throat softly, shifting his weight, but even that small movement seemed distant, muffled by the tension gathering in the space between the counter and her stillness. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the check, a subtle, impatient rhythm, and then he let out a breath through his nose, the kind that carried judgment more than air, his eyes flicking briefly to her name printed neatly on the corner before returning to her face, searching, assessing, reducing, and Angela, for her part, didn't look away, didn't flinch, didn't rush to explain, because she knew something he didn't, something that hadn't yet entered the room, something that would, soon enough, change the way this moment would be remembered. But for now, she stood there in the quiet, the light catching the edge of her cheek, her shoulders squared not in defiance, but in dignity, waiting, not for permission, but for the truth to surface on its own. Angela Brooks did not come to the bank for approval, she came because time had already narrowed her options down to this single moment. And just hours earlier she had been sitting in a stiff plastic chair beneath the low hum of fluorescent lights in St. Mary's Medical Center, the smell of disinfectant lingering in the air while a doctor spoke in careful, measured tones about procedures, timelines, and costs that sounded more like numbers than chances, and she had nodded quietly, absorbing every word without interruption, her fingers wrapped around the folded envelope that held the check now resting under Daniel Carter's hand. A check that represented more than money, it represented borrowed hope, extended trust, and a promise she had made at her mother's bedside where the machines beeped in soft, steady rhythms that felt too fragile to depend on. She had left the hospital just as the morning fog was lifting, stepping out into the cool air, pulling her coat tighter as if it could hold everything together for a few more hours, and during the ride across town, she had stared out the window at passing storefronts and traffic lights, not seeing them, but counting, calculating, steadying her breath the way she had learned to do when life pressed too hard, because panic would not solve anything and anger would only take away what little control she still had, so she chose calm. The same calm that now settled across her face as she stood in front of a man who had already decided who she was before she spoke a single word. Her shoes still carried a faint trace of rainwater from the sidewalk outside, small dark marks fading slowly against the polished floor beneath her, and her hands, though no longer shaking, held a quiet tension, the kind that comes from carrying responsibility alone for too long, yet her posture remained straight, not defensive, not apologetic, simply present. As if she understood that dignity was the one thing no one could take unless she gave it away, and she had no intention of doing that here, not today. Behind the counter, Daniel adjusted his cuff slightly, a habitual motion that revealed more about his discomfort than his composure, because something about Angela did not align with the pattern he relied on. She did not plead, did not over-explain, did not shrink under his gaze, and that absence of reaction created a subtle imbalance in the room. One that no one could quite name but everyone could feel, like a shift in pressure before a storm, and as the clock ticked forward, each second stretched thin, the space between assumption and truth growing narrower, though either of them had crossed it yet, and Angela, standing there with quiet resolve, knew that what mattered most was not how she was seen in this moment, but what she chose to hold on to while she waited for it to pass. Daniel Carter had built his career on reading people in under 10 seconds, a skill he trusted more than any policy manual or system verification, and from where he stood behind the polished counter, Angela Brooks had already been categorized, filed away, and dismissed before her voice even had the chance to enter the equation. To him, the bank was not just a workplace. It was a controlled environment where order was maintained through quiet authority, where numbers made sense and people either fit the pattern or were gently, firmly redirected out of it, and over the years, that belief had hardened into something less flexible, something that no longer paused to question itself, because questioning slowed things down and Daniel Carter did not like delays. The overhead lights reflected sharply off the marble surfaces, clean lines, clean expectations, and he stood there as part of that structure. Every detail of his appearance intentional, from the crisp collar of his shirt to the subtle shine of his shoes, projecting certainty in a space where uncertainty made people uncomfortable, yet beneath that composed exterior, there was a tension he did not acknowledge, a quiet pressure built from quarterly targets, internal reviews, and the constant need to prove that he could maintain control in every interaction, and that pressure had shaped the way he saw moments like this, not as human exchanges, but as potential disruptions that needed to be handled quickly and decisively. He glanced briefly toward the security guard near the entrance, not calling for assistance, but signaling awareness, a silent reinforcement of hierarchy, before returning his focus to Angela, his expression tightening slightly as if the longer she stood there without reacting, the more it unsettled the rhythm he depended on, because he was used to reactions, to raised voices, to defensive explanations, to the predictable patterns that confirmed his assumptions, but Angela offered none of those, and that absence created a space he did not know how to fill. His fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the check, feeling the thickness of the paper, the weight of it disproportionate to what he believed it represented, and he let out a slow breath, his voice measured but edged with dismissal as he spoke again, reinforcing the boundary he had already drawn in his mind, and around them, the bank continued to function in muted motion. Printers humming, keyboards clicking, customers shifting in line. Yet the energy near the counter felt different, quieter, as if something unseen had begun to tilt the balance, though Daniel did not recognize it yet, because from his perspective, this was still a simple situation, one that would end the same way others had, with him maintaining order and the other person stepping aside. But what he failed to notice was the way Angela remained exactly where she was, not challenging him, not retreating, simply holding her place with a calm that did not belong to someone seeking approval, and in that stillness, something fundamental about the moment had already begun to change, even if he had not yet realized it. Angela let the silence settle for one more breath before she spoke, not loudly, not defensively, but with a clarity that carried farther than volume ever could. "Sir, I am not asking for a favor, I am asking you to do your job." And the words did not strike like a challenge, they landed like a simple truth, steady and unembellished, and for a brief moment, even the faint background sounds seemed to soften, as if the room itself had leaned in to hear what would come next. She did not step closer, did not raise her hands, she only shifted her gaze slightly toward the check beneath his fingers, then back to his eyes, holding that quiet line of respect that she refused to let break. And in that small movement, there was something unmistakable, not defiance, not submission, but presence, the kind that could not be ignored no matter how much someone tried to reduce it. Daniel's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the corners of his mouth pressing into a thin line as if her words had disrupted a script he had already decided to follow, and he straightened slightly, drawing himself up behind the counter, reinforcing the invisible barrier between them. His voice cooler now, more deliberate, as though each word was chosen to re-establish control. "My job is to protect this institution from risk," he replied, his tone measured, professional on the surface but edged with something sharper beneath, something that suggested the conversation was already closed in his mind. Angela listened without interruption, her face unchanged, her breathing even, and when he finished, she did not respond immediately, allowing a brief pause to exist between them, a pause that felt longer than it should have, stretching across the polished floor, and the silent attention of those nearby. And then she spoke again, softer this time, but no less certain. "Then verify it," she said, her voice carrying a quiet weight that did not need reinforcement, because it was grounded in something deeper than argument, something that did not rely on his approval to exist. A woman standing 2 places back in line shifted slightly, glancing between them, sensing the tension without fully understanding it, while a teller further down slowed her counting, her hands hovering mid-motion as if caught between continuing her task and witnessing what was unfolding. And Daniel, for the first time since the exchange began, hesitated, not visibly enough for most to notice, but enough for something subtle to shift behind his eyes, because verification meant engagement, and engagement meant the possibility that his initial judgment might be tested. And that was a risk he had not planned to take. His fingers tapped once more against the check, the sound sharper now in the quiet space, and he exhaled slowly, preparing to dismiss the request entirely, to end the interaction on his terms as he had done countless times before. Yet the steadiness in Angela's posture, the absence of fear or urgency in her expression, lingered in a way he could not immediately explain, and for the briefest second, the certainty he relied on felt less solid than it had moments ago, as if something unseen had begun to press back against it, not with force, but with quiet, undeniable presence. Daniel's patience thinned in a way that did not show on his face but revealed itself in the sharpness of his movements, and without another word, he lifted the check between 2 fingers as if it were something questionable, something that did not belong in his space, and for a split second, the room seemed to hold its breath again. The faint hum of machines fading into the background as attention narrowed to the fragile piece of paper suspended in his hand. Angela's eyes followed the motion. Not with panic, not with pleading, but with a quiet awareness of what he was about to do, and though her chest tightened slightly, her shoulders remained steady, grounded in a composure that had carried her through far heavier moments than this. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on her as if waiting for a reaction that would justify the decision already forming in his mind, but when none came, when she simply stood there with that same unwavering calm, something in him hardened, and with a single, deliberate motion, he tore the check cleanly down the middle, the sound crisp and unmistakable, echoing louder than it should have in the controlled stillness of the bank. A soft gasp came from somewhere behind Angela, quickly swallowed by silence, and the security guard near the door shifted his stance, no longer pretending to look outside, while a teller paused mid-count, bills held frozen between her fingers. The 2 halves of the check remained in Daniel's hand for a moment before he let them fall onto the counter, sliding slightly across the polished surface, and his voice, when it came, was calm, almost indifferent. "We do not process suspicious documents," he said, as if stating a policy rather than making a choice, as if the act itself required no explanation beyond the authority he believed he carried. Angela looked down at the torn pieces, her reflection faintly visible in the glossy counter beneath them, and for a brief second, the weight of everything pressed inward, the hospital room, the quiet beeping machines, her mother's hand resting weakly in hers, the promise she had made, all converging in that single, fractured image. Yet she did not reach for the pieces immediately, she did not argue, did not raise her voice, because somewhere deeper than the shock, she understood that reacting now would not restore what had been torn, and so she allowed the moment to settle, to reveal itself fully before she moved. When she finally bent down, it was slow, deliberate, her fingers gathering the 2 halves with care as if they still held value, as if they were not defined by the way they had just been treated, and when she straightened again, her eyes lifted to meet Daniel's, not with anger, not with defeat, but with something far more unsettling, a quiet, undeniable dignity that did not match the outcome he expected, and around them, the silence remained, heavier now, not empty, but filled with the unspoken recognition that something had crossed a line, even if no one had said it out loud. Angela did not move right away after she gathered the torn pieces, and for a moment she simply stood there with them resting lightly in her hands, the edges uneven, fragile, yet still whole in a way that could not be measured by paper alone, and the sunlight filtering through the tall glass windows shifted slightly, casting a softer glow across the counter, catching on the faint crease of her fingers as she aligned the two halves together. Not to fix them, but to acknowledge that they still belonged to her, that their meaning had not disappeared just because someone had chosen not to see it. The bank around her resumed its quiet rhythm, but it felt different now, slower, as if each movement carried an awareness that had not been there before, the distant sound of a printer starting up again, the low murmur of a conversation restarting near the back, yet none of it fully returned to normal. Because the stillness she held had settled into the space like something permanent, Angela lowered her gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in reflection, her breath steady, controlled, as if she were grounding herself in something deeper than the moment unfolding around her, and in that silence, memories passed through her mind not as distractions, but as anchors, the soft hum of the hospital room, the faint squeeze of her mother's hand, the quiet promise she had made without words, all of it reminding her why she had come here, why this mattered, and why she could not let someone else's judgment redefine the truth she carried. When she lifted her head again, her expression had not hardened, it had softened, not with weakness, but with clarity, the kind that comes when a person chooses who they are going to be regardless of what stands in front of them, and she placed the torn check gently on the counter, not pushing it forward, not pulling it back, simply letting it rest there between them as a quiet statement that the moment was not over. Even if it had been mishandled, Daniel watched her, his posture unchanged, but something in his stillness shifted slightly, because the reaction he expected had not come. There was no raised voice, no visible frustration, no retreat, and that absence created a space he could not easily fill, a pause that lingered longer than it should have, stretching between them without resolution. The clock on the wall ticked forward, each second marking time that no longer felt routine, and Angela's voice, when it came, was softer than before, but carried further. "I will wait," she said, not as a request, not as a challenge, but as a simple decision, and then she stepped back just enough to give the counter its distance again, her hands now resting calmly at her sides, her presence no less steady, no less certain, as if she understood that sometimes the strongest response was not to push, but to remain, to allow the truth to surface in its own time, and in that quiet, measured pause, something unseen began to shift beneath the surface of the moment, something that neither of them had yet named, but both could feel approaching. The sound of the front door's opening did not announce itself loudly, but something about it shifted the air in a way that made a few heads turn before anyone understood why, and a man stepped inside with an unhurried pace that did not match the usual rhythm of the bank, his presence quiet yet unmistakably grounded, as if he did not need to claim authority because it followed him naturally. Marcus Brooks paused just inside the entrance, his eyes scanning the room not with curiosity, but with familiarity, taking in the layout, the movement, the subtle tension that lingered near the counter, and for a brief moment, his gaze settled there. Drawn not by noise, but by stillness, by the way one figure stood composed while the space around her felt slightly unsettled. He adjusted his jacket lightly, the gesture simple, almost absent-minded, and began walking forward, each step measured, neither rushed nor delayed, while the security guard straightened instinctively, recognition flickering across his face though no words were exchanged, and behind the counter, one of the tellers glanced up, then quickly back down, her hands moving again but with less certainty than before. Daniel Carter did not notice him at first, his focus still fixed on maintaining the frame of control he believed he held, but as Marcus drew closer, something shifted in the room, subtle but undeniable, like a change in pressure that made people instinctively adjust without knowing why, and it was only when a junior employee near the far desk straightened abruptly, whispering something under her breath, that Daniel's attention broke for a fraction of a second. His eyes flicked toward the entrance, then back to Angela, then again toward the approaching figure, and in that brief sequence, recognition struck, not dramatically, not with visible shock, but with a tightening of posture so slight it might have gone unnoticed if the moment were not already stretched thin. Marcus stopped a few feet from the counter, his gaze moving first to the torn pieces resting between Angela and Daniel, then to Angela herself, and in that instant, something softened in his expression. Not in surprise, but in understanding, as if he had already pieced together more than anyone had said. Angela turned her head slightly, sensing the shift before seeing it, and when her eyes met Marcus's, there was no visible reaction, no sudden relief or urgency, just a quiet acknowledgement, the kind shared between two people who did not need to explain what was already clear. Marcus's attention returned to Daniel, his voice calm when he spoke, not raised, not sharp, but carrying a weight that settled into the space immediately. "Walk me through what happened here," he said, and the words did not demand, they required, leaving no room for dismissal, no space for deflection. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time since the exchange began, the certainty he relied on did not arrive with his words, and the room, once again, fell into a silence that felt different from before, no longer tense with assumption, but suspended on the edge of something that was about to be revealed. Daniel felt the weight of the question settle on him before he could even form an answer, and for a brief moment, the carefully constructed structure he relied on seemed to lose its balance, not collapsing, but shifting just enough to expose the uncertainty beneath it, and he cleared his throat lightly, straightening his shoulders as if posture alone could restore control. "It was a standard verification issue," he began, his voice measured, professional, yet lacking the quiet confidence it carried moments earlier, and as he spoke, his eyes flicked briefly toward the torn pieces on the counter before returning to Marcus. "The document appeared irregular, so I followed protocol." And the words sounded correct, structured, aligned with policy, but something in the room did not accept them as complete. Marcus listened without interruption, his gaze steady, not confrontational, but focused in a way that made each word feel examined beyond its surface, and when Daniel finished, there was a pause, not long, but deliberate, as if allowing the explanation to settle fully before responding, and then Marcus shifted his attention slightly toward the counter, toward the two uneven halves resting where they had been left, his hand moving forward just enough to touch one edge lightly, not to pick it up, but to acknowledge it, and when he spoke again, his tone remained calm. But there was a clarity in it that left little room for interpretation. "Protocol requires verification, not destruction," he said, each word placed carefully, not raised, not emphasized, yet carrying a weight that seemed to expand in the quiet space around them. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest sign of tension surfacing as the gap between his justification and the reality in front of him became harder to bridge, and for the first time, his gaze shifted away from Marcus, dropping briefly before returning, as if recalibrating, searching for a response that would restore alignment, but none came quickly. Angela remained where she was, her presence unchanged, not stepping forward, not retreating, simply witnessing the moment unfold with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning, and Marcus glanced toward her again, the briefest acknowledgement passing between them, not spoken, but understood, before his attention returned to Daniel. "Tell me," Marcus continued, his voice softer now, but somehow more direct, "at what point did you decide not to check?" And the question did not accuse, it revealed, drawing a line between what should have happened and what had, and in that space, Daniel felt something unfamiliar, not fear, not yet, but a recognition that the situation was no longer within the boundaries he had defined, and around them, the bank remained still, the quiet no longer passive, but attentive, as if every detail now carried meaning, every second holding weight. And for the first time since the moment began, the balance of the room had shifted completely, no longer centered on authority, but on truth. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came at first, and in that brief, suspended silence, something far more revealing than any explanation settled into place, because for the first time, he was not managing the moment, he was standing inside it without control, and his gaze drifted, not toward Marcus, but toward the counter, toward the torn pieces that now carried more weight than the intact document ever had. And he inhaled slowly, as if searching for the version of himself that had been so certain just minutes earlier, but all he found was the quiet recognition that certainty had not been truth, it had been assumption. Marcus did not press him, did not repeat the question, he simply waited, his posture steady, his presence firm without force, and that patience created a space where there was no urgency to defend, only an expectation to understand, and finally, Daniel spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "I made a judgment," he said, the words simple, but heavier than anything he had said before, and when he looked up, his eyes did not hold authority, they held awareness, the kind that arrives only after something has already gone too far to undo. Marcus nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement, as if the truth, once spoken, did not need to be argued, and then his attention shifted briefly to Angela, who remained composed, her presence unchanged, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady, not demanding anything, not expecting anything, simply present in the moment as it was. Marcus reached into his jacket and retrieved his phone, his movements calm, deliberate, and after a brief glance at the screen, he turned it slightly toward Daniel. Just enough for him to see the name displayed, and though no words accompanied the gesture, the meaning was unmistakable, the account, the signature, the authority behind the check, all of it now visible in a way that left no room for doubt, and Daniel's breath caught almost imperceptibly as the final piece of the reality he had dismissed settled into place. The room remained quiet, but the silence had changed, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, it had become clear, grounded. And Marcus placed the phone back into his pocket before speaking again, his voice even. "We will process this correctly," he said, not as a command, but as a restoration of what should have happened from the beginning, and then, after a brief pause, he added, softer now, "And we will do better than this." And the words lingered, not directed at anyone in particular, but settling over the space as something larger than the moment itself. Angela stepped forward just enough to place the aligned pieces of the check back onto the counter, her movements calm, unhurried, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet strength it had from the beginning. "That is all I needed," she said, not asking for recognition, not seeking apology, simply stating what had always been true, and Daniel nodded slowly, the motion small, but sincere, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something more honest, and as Angela turned and walked toward the glass doors, the sunlight outside catching softly against the floor ahead of her, the room did not follow her with noise or reaction, it held still, as if understanding that what had just occurred did not need to be spoken aloud to be remembered, and behind her, Daniel remained where he was, not moving, not speaking, his gaze resting on the counter where the torn paper had been, now no longer just a mistake, but a moment that had revealed something he could not ignore, and in that quiet, for the first time, he understood that authority meant nothing without the willingness to see, and that some lessons did not arrive with force, but with silence that stayed long after the moment had passed.